Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome our featured speaker for this month. This is, if you raise your hand, this is Jakob Mchangama, although now he's from Denmark, but now that he has moved to the United States, he goes by Jake or Jacob. So he's currently at Vanderbilt University, where he is a research professor and also the director of the Future of Free Speech program. Jacob is a grantee of ours, a current and former grantee for his work on free speech, the future and the past of it, and also ways that we can use free speech as a force for good, also to counter misinformation and hate speech and so forth. If you have not read his book, Free Speech: A History from Socrates to Social Media, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books that I read last year. It is, if you're interested in theology, science, philosophy, history, politics, any topics that are of import for our history and for our world, it's a great way. It's a great exploration of the way that free speech and human rights have intersect with those topics, and highly readable and very enjoyable and very smart. So please join me in welcoming Jacob.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I think this is my third Templeton grant over the years, so I've had a lot to do with people here. So it's great to meet some of the faces behind many emails back and forth, and we really appreciate the support. It's been instrumental for the work that we're doing. So delighted to be given the opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're thinking about, some of the things we've done, and some of the things that we plan to do. Just a bit of background, as you said, Greg. I moved to the U.S. a year and a half ago, set up the Future of Free Speech. So we're an independent 501c3, but based at Vanderbilt University. We have a great collaboration with them, and it's sort of a win-win because I don't have to teach, I don't have to take orders from the administration, and we have sort of a matching grant also arrangement with them. So it's been really a good setup for us. Though I did not, the transition from Copenhagen to Tennessee was not seamless, but it's actually been quite good, even though the cultural overlap is not straightforward. So I want to talk a bit about what I call the free speech recession that I think the world is going through right now. And it might be a bit counterintuitive to talk about a free speech recession, because after all, we live in a world where people around the world have unprecedented abilities to share and access information in ways that it was unimaginable to past generations. If you go back to 2000, President Clinton had just signed an agreement which would put China on the process to join the WTO, and he was sort of making a joke that sure, the Chinese were trying to censor the internet, but that would be like nailing Jello to a wall, and good luck with that. So that was a sense of optimism that after the end of communism, technology would fuel, supercharge freedom and democracy, and these values would triumph around the world, and authoritarianism and censorship would basically be consigned to the ash heap of history. It would no longer be possible to do what autocrats had always done. And for a while, it looked like that was also the trajectory of the world. So we had a long sort of third wave of democratization, where we saw democracy and freedom spread to continents around the globe. The high tide was maybe the Arab Spring, where there was this idea that now Silicon Valley was actually this force for good that had shown the capabilities of what you might call liberation technology. But when you look closer at the stats, you can actually see that many of the gains in terms of free speech have actually been rolled back. So if you take the period from 1994 up until today, you'll see that the map gets lighter and lighter, and the more light, the more white a country, the less robust the free speech protections around the world. And some of these losses are quite significant. Take a country like India. So more than 1 billion people live in India. So whether free speech is protected or not has a huge impact on the status of free speech around the world. So we can think of maybe India as a democratic swing state, because one of the things that you'll see is that democracy and free speech go hand in hand. So there's a very strong, robust relationship between democracy and free speech, which is not surprising. But unfortunately, as I'll try and show you, this is a lesson that has been unlearned by a lot of leaders in democracies today. And this free speech recession affects democracy in very significant ways. So democracy, as I said, is also going backwards, and free speech remains the worst affected component. So when you look at countries that are backsliding in terms of democracy, free speech is the worst affected component. So you might say there's a straight line between 411 BCE, when the Athenian democracy was overthrown for the first time in history, where you had an anti-democratic coup. What was the first thing that oligarchs did at the time? Well, it was to suppress free speech, imprison, murder proponents of democracy. And that is still lesson one in the authoritarian's playbook. If you want to control, if you want to rule without input from your citizens, you got to control free speech. And in today's world, that means controlling the internet. So we've gone from liberation technology to a situation where authoritarians have learned to reverse engineer this technology, which to a very large degree today serves as a tool for high-tech surveillance and censorship, rather than providing a voice to people, or at least it has sort of dual purposes in many ways. And it's something that I'll come back to. We also see that authoritarian regimes have been very clever in exploiting the fears, the panics around false information. So you see that the number of journalists around the world imprisoned under charges for false news have increased dramatically. You see that especially after sort of the trend grows after the US election in 2016, where there's this narrative that Russian disinformation basically decided the election, and then the pandemic, where we talk about an infodemic, and lots of countries adopt laws to combat false news. But even in open democracies, you see this development. So last year we did a survey, or we asked researchers in 22 open democracies around the world, from Taiwan to Brazil, to Canada, the US, lots of European countries, South Africa, to look at the number of laws affecting free speech, laws and policies affecting free speech in your countries, and then qualify them as whether they're speech protective or speech restrictive. And we found that the vast majority of these laws and policies were speech restrictive. They far outnumbered the number of speech protective ones. So this is in the traditional heartland of free speech in democracies, those who are supposed to be the global guardians of this, that this is going on. Here are some examples that might not be surprising, but it still tells you a bit about the scale, that under Putin now, the repression actually surpasses that of post-Stalinist Soviet Union in terms of crackdown. So that's quite a dramatic development, I think. Another example is Hong Kong, traditionally an outlier along with Taiwan, but basically an example of a small city-state that combined both economic and personal freedom, but in very short time, mainland China has subverted Hong Kong's traditional civil liberties. And the first prong of this attack was to crack down fiercely on free speech. That was essential for mainland China. So what do I mean about free speech restrictions in open democracies? So I'm going to focus mostly on the digital age. You support or have supported great groups like FIRE who document things that goes on in campus. All of that is really important as well, because that talks to the culture of free speech, which ultimately is the most important component for a thriving for free speech to thrive. I mean, take this country, the First Amendment was ratified in 1791. The wording remains the same, but the scope of the protection of the First Amendment has expanded dramatically over time. So that goes to show a change in cultural perception of the importance of free speech among Americans, among judges, and all that. But I think because we live in a more digital world, ultimately the culture of free speech online is going to have a huge impact on that as well. So that's what I want to focus a bit on today. And even though I've moved to the new world, I want to talk about developments in the old world, because I think there was a time when Americans could say, okay, if Europeans want to be crazy and pass all kinds of laws restricting free speech, that's a shame, but that's their problem. We have the First Amendment, and we don't need to care about what's going on in Europe. That no longer is the case, because to a large degree, the practical exercise of free speech takes place on global platforms that might have been founded and are still headquartered in Silicon Valley, but where the European Union in particular has been much more assertive and aggressive in adopting legislation with the stated purpose of becoming the so-called global gold standard for platform regulation, both for social media, but now also for AI. And as you probably know, in general, European law allows many more restrictions on free speech, political speech, than does the First Amendment, which means that to a large extent, platforms, US-based platforms who have this ideal, unrealized ideal of having global standards for their terms of service or acceptable use policies, when we talk about AI, have tried to sort of accommodate the European Union, because under the Digital Services Act, for instance, you risk a fine of up to 6% of your global turnover if you don't comply with the Digital Services Act. So that's a pretty significant power grab, and you might say something that results in moderation without representation, in the sense that laws adopted in Brussels or Berlin or Paris can have an indirect but significant effect on the climate of free speech in the US and elsewhere around the world. So a pretty stark example of this was Cherry Bouton. How many of you have heard about Cherry Bouton? By raise your hand, I see one at least. So Cherry Bouton, until recently, was a very aggressive commissioner in the European Union. He was responsible for the Digital Services Act, which he used to nakedly pursue his agendas, sending threatening letters to Mark Zuckerberg and others saying, well, you have to remove this or that content that he didn't like. And when Elon Musk said that, hey, I'm going to do a live interview with Donald Trump, he sent a letter to Elon Musk saying, make sure that you comply with the European Union rules for content moderation. So even though the interview hadn't aired yet, a commissioner from the European Union sends a threatening letter to the CEO of a US-based company wanting to do a live interview with the presidential candidate in a US election, which probably is whether you like the candidate or not, is pretty interesting to to people in the US who have to make up their minds on who they vote on. But apparently, the European Union thought that this is something that they have some kind of jurisdiction over. So that, I think, is a pretty significant challenge that will have a huge bearing on the future of free speech. Another issue, of course, is AI. And AI, of course, covers a lot of different technologies, and we're focused mostly on generative AI and the impact on free speech. And I think it's going to be huge, but we already see sort of a harms and safety risk-based approach to how generative AI should be developed, should be deployed, what kind of content you should be able to generate. And I think that's a huge issue that we are focusing on. And I'm very surprised that not more organizations are focusing on this. But so far it is not something that has gained that much attention, and I think that's unfortunate. Though, of course, for us, maybe gives us an opportunity to stand out. So, how is censorship involving online? I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about our mission, our focus, current work, and future goals after having sort of set the scene. Overall, our mission is to restore what we call a resilient global culture of free speech in the digital age. So again, that goes back to the fact that even though we're based in the US, even though our lodestar is the First Amendment, we have a global focus, and as I mentioned some of the reasons for that, not only because I think that laws in Europe and elsewhere can impact the practical realization of or exercise of free speech in this country, but also because I think the current retreat from the First Amendment and this tendency to sort of, among many scholars, to see the First Amendment has gone too far, has implications globally, whereas the First Amendment for a long time pushed the rest of the world in a positive, more speech protective direction. But if the US retreats from that, then that's going to have downstream effects for the global culture and standard setting in the world. So here is a bit more granular on some of the things that I talked about in terms of Europe. This is the current president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. So when she was running to be reelected as commissioner, as president of the Commission, she, in my hometown of Copenhagen, promised that she would adopt a European democracy shield to combat foreign interference at EU level. And so she was essentially saying that on top of the Digital Services Act that I mentioned, she would oblige platforms to detect and then remove any propaganda. So basically outsourcing censorship to private companies, but with a legal obligation backed up by threats of these massive fines. And that, I think, is very much the approach of the European Union. It's quite ironic, I think, that next month it'll be, if my math is okay, the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that precipitated the end of the Cold War. And at the time, both the US and Europe saw free speech and technology as a competitive advantage against authoritarian states. It was basically a gamble, sort of saying, if we give dissidents behind the Iron Curtain these principles, these values, but also if we broadcast radio, if we ensure the distribution of pamphlets, if we smuggle in printers and so on, that will help delegitimize these regimes. It will empower dissidents behind the Iron Curtain. And it worked to a large extent. Today, it seems to be the case that, especially in Europe, but I think also in the US, free speech and technology, modern technology, is seen as a Trojan horse, which allows the enemies of democracies, both foreign and domestic, to undermine these values, and therefore free speech is more seen as a threat, or at least we're very ambivalent about it. So that's a huge shift in a relatively short amount of time from seeing free speech as a competitive advantage of democracies as to a threat. And I think what we're seeing is that there used to be much more bright lines between how open democracies and authoritarian regimes viewed free speech. Where do you draw the limit? Today, those lines are getting more blurred. That is not to say that in France and Germany, there are political prisoners, that political speech is not free, that you don't have free media. Those things are in place. But it's also true that there are crackdowns on speech that would shock most Americans. And to an extent, which I think would shock many in these countries, but it's not something that generates a public backlash in Europe. And that's one of the things that I fear, that it's just sort of a process where people shrug, sometimes say, oh yeah, maybe they went too far here, or sometimes people are behind it. Again, Thierry Breton, just to show how far-ranging this idea is. He at one point said that the Digital Services Act would legitimize the blanket ban on platforms. So you could basically, the European Union, the European Commission, a political body which also acts as a regulator under the Digital Services Act, could shut down entire social media platforms if they didn't comply with the Digital Services Act. So this is something that we normally see in authoritarian regimes. It's something that you saw in Venezuela recently after Maduro blatantly corrupted the election, announced himself as a winner. He shut down X because he said hate speech was spreading. But this is actually something that is being entertained in the largest group of democracies in the world. So that's a huge shift in emphasis. But also just the what I like to call elite panic that undergirds this. So take this statement from Vera Jourova, another European commissioner, who says that AI-generated videos of political figures could be an atomic bomb to change the course of voter preferences. So all these statements came before, you all know that 2024 is like a super election year. Some 2 billion people around the world are eligible to vote in elections. And that's been this narrative that AI and disinformation risk drowning out this mass exercise of democracy around the world. And you see that very clearly in these statements. And of course, there are instances where disinformation and other types of speech can lead to concrete harms. But as I'll get back to, I think there's good evidence that those harms have been significantly overemphasized by leaders in democracies. One of the things that we did to sort of test sort of more empirically whether there's basis for this for these assumptions about the flood of illegal content was we looked at the number of comments that were deleted on Facebook and YouTube regarding politicians and media outlets in Germany, Sweden, and France. And we found, and so we had researchers who were experts in the laws in those countries. They went through a representative sample of more than 1 million comments that we were able to scrape. And what you see here paints a completely different picture from what you hear from most politicians who will say that, social media is awash in illegal content. So in almost all cases, more than 90% of the deleted comments were perfectly legal. And the majority of those legal comments were not even particularly controversial. Like they didn't even sort of raise questions of whether this is hate speech or not. Unfortunately, this is not the narrative that you see a lot. Because the total amount of comments is so huge, you can always cherry pick comments and say, well, look, someone said something outrageous on Twitter. And that happens thousands of times a day, or on Facebook or wherever. But, you have to, I think, have a wider picture. And what we see is that if there's a problem in terms of content moderation, it's probably over moderation rather than under moderation, at least if you prioritize the value of free speech. But even here in the US, we see that half of US states have either adopted or are in the process of adopting laws to crack down on AI in elections, typically deepfake, laws against deepfake. And you see a discernible development in American attitudes about what the government should do about online false information. So if you go back to 2018, I don't think you can see that, but so when it comes to, like, the 39% was back in 2018, so only 39% were in favor of the government doing something about false information, even if it restricted online information. In 2023, it was a majority of 55%. So that shows a weakening resolve around core First Amendment tenets, even in the US. And California adopted a number of these bills, and that was enjoined. So presumably it will. It's a violation of the First Amendment. But I think this is a huge battleground in the U.S. Going forward. And you can imagine that what happens next month, when all of you get to decide who gets to be your president for the next 4 years, you can imagine that there will be events surrounding the election that will have a huge outcome, both in terms of attitudes towards, disinformation, but also in terms of laws being proposed going forward. So why do I say that there's this elite panic? So I showed you our research on illegal content, but this is what is the current status quo when we look at elections in Europe, and it's actually the same picture in many of the other elections that have taken place around the world. That AI disinformation or deepfakes did not impact elections in the UK, in France, or in the European parliamentary elections, despite this constant drumbeat about how dangerous disinformation and AI was to these elections. We've actually not seen an impact. It's the same in India, even though there are all kinds of problems in the Indian democracy. What we actually have seen is that in India, for instance, generative AI has been used creatively by political candidates. So India, of course, is a huge country. Many different languages are spoken. So we've seen candidates do deepfakes of themselves where they speak in a different language so that they're able to communicate with people in states in India where the majority might not speak that language. So I think there's some evidence that generative AI has actually been done more good than bad in this super election year. Another huge battleground, of course, is what happens with chatbots that we all use. I mean, most of you probably use ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. And what we've done is look at what kinds of policies govern this. And what we found, surprisingly, was that the policies on these chatbots, the most popular ones, are more restrictive than social media platforms in terms of acceptable use, which is surprising, right? Because if I interact with GPT, I essentially am engaging with an AI system. I'm not publicizing my thoughts to anyone in the way that I do on Facebook or X or Instagram, where I'm communicating something that potentially could be seen by millions. Unless I make a conscious choice to take whatever is generated by ChatGPT and publish it, it's essentially just me engaging with an AI system. Nonetheless, there are very robust limits that will, so prompts will be refused, certain types of content will not be generated. And the huge danger here is that generative AI is now being integrated into word processing, email, and so on. So, if I have a laptop with an internet connection and Word, I can write hate speech. I can disseminate it at scale much easier than anyone in the analog age. But everyone would be outraged if you opened Word and you were writing something. Let's say you were writing a novel, or let's say you were writing a historical book about the legacy of slavery in the U.S. And you were writing something, you were quoting John Calhoun, and Word said, hey, you can't do that because it violates our policies. Or you write it, you attach it to an email and you send it, and Gmail or Outlook says, we're not going to be able to deliver your email because we scanned the content and what you wrote violates our policies. But this is actually what is possible now, and something we really need to grapple with, because if, and especially also as generative AI is integrated into search, it basically not only becomes about a question about freedom of expression and access to information, it becomes a question about freedom of thought. Because if, the way that you interact with the digital world, if all of that is filtered through particular lenses, then, how you access information will be determined in ways that might be completely biased without you even realizing it, and especially for younger generations who might not have the knowledge that we do, that where we can sort of ask critical questions. I think that's a hugely important question, where our idea is to say we got to have user empowerment as the guiding principles, not sort of systemic risk where we need to avoid all potential harms of interacting with generative AI going forward. So that's a huge battleground for us. And just quickly about some of our current work before I turn it over to you, is we're mapping AI censorship in 12 countries. So we're looking both at how governments censor AI, but also looking at trying to build a ranking system of the most popular chatbots, sort of which of the chatbots are most protective of free speech, which ones are the most restrictive, which might be able to put both transparency, but also put some pressure, give some tools for advocacy. We're creating these tools to empower users to combat harmful online speech, because we realize and recognize that there can be harms in free speech. A lot of people are worried about free speech in the digital age, and free speech advocates are very good at being principled, slippery slope arguments, but that's ultimately not going to always convince a skeptical, fearful public. So what we try to do is say, okay, here are these tools. Free speech and access to information actually empowers you to do something about the concerns that you have. So we've built this AI-powered counter-speech tool called the Frequalizer, inspired by the ideas of Frederick Douglass, that allows people in civil society groups to scale up their ability to do counter-speech. We've done a bunch of trainings around the globe. We're doing the same thing with misinformation. We're also developing a prototype for more distributed content moderation, one that empowers users again. So if you we're never going to have agreement on where, what should be acceptable online or not. So our idea is to say, well, let's empower users to make more decisions about what kind of content that they want, rather than saying governments or big corporations should make those calls. It's much better, if you're in a group that only wants to discuss knitting, then that's perfectly fine that you don't want political content. Or if you want to discuss religion and you don't want to have atheists completely troll your group, that's also fine. But it becomes problematic if the platform decides no atheism or no political speech. So that's a way to sort of have an organic bottom-up approach rather than a centralized top-down approach to the digital sphere, which I think is one of the more Solomonic solutions to a very hard problem going forward. Lastly, I want to just share that earlier this month, we had our first Global Free Speech Summit in Nashville, which is going to be sort of our landmark event annually. We had some great speakers. I encourage you, especially, I don't know if you already work with Audrey Tang, who was the first digital minister in Taiwan, someone who thinks extremely creatively about the challenges in our digital. So how can you both create trust while ensuring an open digital democracy? She's done pioneering work, which I think is really important for how we go forward. And Taiwan, in many ways, I see as a model for a country that has resisted massive Chinese disinformation attempts, but without resorting to censorship, and retains a very high degree of trust and low degrees of polarization, which shows that it's not necessarily a trade-off like more free speech, more polarization. No, that's not necessarily the way forward in the digital world. We have some future goals, create this transparent free expression-based frameworks for AI companies and governments. We want to develop these guidelines that we'd like to see companies and governments sign up to, a bit like the Santa Clara principles for content moderation that were developed some years ago, these free speech rankings that I mentioned. And essentially what we hope is to create a much more open digital future, one where we once again see free speech as a competitive advantage for open democracies, as something that should not be feared, something that should be embraced, but again, with the clear understanding that free speech comes with costs and harms, but that censorship is a cure worse than the disease. That was true in ancient Athens, and we believe that's also true in the 21st century. So thank you.